Hi, this is Nigel Baldwin, co-founder at Phraktion. I think joined today by fellow co-founders Paul Reynolds and Gordon Harvey. I don't know if Gordon's on the screen there, but they're the co-founders today for the next peer-to-peer webinar. I think as you came in, you heard we are live recording, so we will use today's session for marketing purposes into the future. So any issue with that, then please do let me know. Likewise, we seem to have an issue with a note taker. So if you do receive an email after this meeting, you don't want the notes, then please just delete, of course. But we will provide that recording as part of our marketing shortly after today's session. So anyway, with that, next slide, please, John. So just to set out for any newcomers, or any members outside of Phraktion, Phraktion really has a bold ambition today of changing how pharma works. And we're very serious about that. And we're doing that by building a community of experts in biopharma, working together and exchanging knowledge and skills, really on a global scale now. We're connected together to deliver projects or to solve any problem, either as individuals or as teams. And really in doing that, we're beginning to shape how the biopharma industry tackles its issues and the way we work. And I think for those of us who are lucky enough to be in London at the Royal Society of Medicine last Thursday, we had a packed room where we discussed is the future of pharma fractured or fractional. You really sensed the belief in the room that industry does need to change, and fractional resourcing expertise is a way forward to gain better efficiency across our industry. So you'll see recordings of that as they come out onto YouTube as well. So do look out for that as well. So with that, next slide, please, John. So I have the pleasure in introducing our speaker today. So John Cogan, based in Toronto, Canada, I think, to present today's session on elevating creativity in pharma. So hopefully I was somewhat creative there, John, but perhaps after the end of the session, we'll all be much better at doing.
I sure hope so. If we've done our job, at least 1%
sure.
better.
So, yeah. But just say something a little bit about John. So John has over 20 years of experience helping brands to simplify their story, always a good thing, and to create connected experiences. John has worked with many serious large global brands, including Moderna, Pfizer, J&J, Eli Lilly, and many more. To get to the root of the problem, John asked many questions that are necessary to get to the problem, to create alignment and brand direction, and really to understand your strategic priorities, and really lay the groundwork for the campaigns to flourish. So with that, John, I'm sure you can do a much better introduction to yourself. Over to you.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Nigel. And again, I won't spend much time at all talking about myself. I want to get right into the topic. And again, this is one of those topics we can go on about for days, literally. And there's certainly a lot more to say than I'll be able to get to within this session. But we'll touch on some of those things, and obviously happy to, whether through a follow-up session or individually with any one of you, happy to kind of go into more detail. But I do
John,
want to talk about.
I can hear you quite clearly, but Jane is saying to speak up or turn your mic up.
Oh,
if that's saying for
here, let me put my AirPod on, see if that helps. Testing, 1, 2. Is that better?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Here? Perfect. All right. Let me know if anyone. Usually, I have many challenges. One of them is my volume is not usually one of them. It's actually the opposite problem. So, especially my kids telling me to quiet down. So, it's fun to have the opposite problem once in a while. So, again, we want to talk about elevating communications in pharma, and this is a risky topic to get in. Anytime you talk about, effective communications in a presentation, I joke it's like my neighbor runs a big landscaping business, and anytime his lawn looks a little bit brown or dry, I kind of get on his case. So if I'm here to talk about how to, communicate effectively, it better be a pretty good presentation. So I'll hold myself to that standard and hope you guys enjoy the next 20, 30 minutes or so. But really, before we get into, we're talking about elevating creativity and elevating the effectiveness of communications in the pharma world, I want to kind of unpack what that is, what that means. How can we do that? And it seems a bit cliched to go to Nike, one of the biggest brands in the world, but it is a great story to kind of illustrate where I'm going with this and how I think the parallels to the pharma industry. You can see, this is a Nike ad from the mid to late 70s. Their communication did not always look like it does today. This actually looks more like an ad we often see in our world, in the pharma world, really talking about the functionality and the functional benefits of their product. And they, obviously arrived at something very different, not necessarily with intentionality. And a lot of creativity doesn't necessarily happen in a planned way. Often it happens by happenstance through circumstance. And it's, recognizing it when it happens and grabbing it and holding on to it is as powerful as, intentionally coming up with the idea in the first place. Now, this was a real turning point. This ad, I'm not going to ask you to try to read that with a magnifying glass. But what happened is they had booked space. I believe this is Runner's World magazine back in the late 70s and had no new innovative product to put in. So one of the writers from their agency just kind of did this little essay on the struggle of being a runner and this idea that it's about the journey and not the destination. And it just really resonated with people. And this idea that this is not a company that's now focusing on, the technicalities of the shoe and, like in this case, how it's great for my knee. They're talking about a real struggle that I identify with. And that resonated and it blew up. And that was a real turning point for Nike that eventually led to everything we see today, where if you look, from where they were on the left to where they are now, one notable difference is you don't even see the word Nike. That's how strong a brand they've built. And the word just is really encapsulates everything that was in that, story in the middle ad here that I'm not going to make you read, but you can certainly Google it. Just is all about embracing the imperfection of humanity. And it's about, we all know the struggle. We all get how hard it's going to be, but just go for it. Just do it. Just put all that aside and do it anyway. And that's the essence of Nike and kind of bringing out the best, the athlete in all of us. And now they can do that without saying much at all. 3 short, 1-syllable words and a logo that they came up with that was nothing before. So that, that is the absolute far end of the spectrum. There's, maybe only, less than 10 brands in the world that will ever get to that level of affinity, recognition, and loyalty. But we can certainly move from where, we are probably closer to the left side of the spectrum and somewhere closer to that on the right. So I go back to this question, what makes communication effective? How do we do that? And, I'm going to start with a really simple equation and then start to unpack it a little. And like I said, we won't be able to get to the level of depth we need to in this session, but certainly hope to push things in the right direction and get the ball rolling. So it really is 2 very packed and important concepts. One is capturing attention. And that often comes from a little bit of dissonance and a little bit of, breaking expectation. And we'll talk about that. And the other part is impact. And that's impact in terms of how people think, how people feel, probably most importantly, and then ultimately how people behave. And moving that needle can come in any of those forms, but certainly requires all of those elements: thought, feeling, the brain, the heart, and the hands, if you will, to really make things happen from a branding perspective. So let's go a layer deeper. How do we grab attention? Those are outputs. Attention and impact are outputs. How do we grab attention? How do we move that needle? And to me, it's about really 3 elements. Most importantly, focus, being able to, really get down to the one thing that matters most. Clarity, to do it in a way that's simple, that people understand, and resonance, to do it in a way that really connects, especially emotionally. And even when we're talking about, a cardiologist, an endocrinologist, a pharmacist, or a patient, emotional resonance is just as important for any of them as it is for a runner or someone buying, fast food product or shoes. And those 3 elements really are the core. I mean, a communication is not going to be effective if it's not focused on one thing and simple and resonant in some way. It can be amplified through disruption. So I say to the power of disruption. And disruption really has to do, like I said, with breaking expectation, with creating some dissonance, because we all know as humans, and doctors are no different, who we're often communicating with, we operate in kind of that autopilot state. We are not spending much time in an analytical, thoughtful state. And to get people out of that autopilot mode, to really think differently about a situation, to think differently about their behavior, and to maybe try something new or to break a habit, requires a level of dissonance and disruption to really grab us. And that, to me, is what takes, really good, effective communication to that next level. So again, we're going to keep kind of peeling back layers here, and that's going to become a theme to figure out, how do we get to all that. Now, let's talk about pharmaceuticals. And I don't want to paint us all with one brush. A lot of us are from different parts of the world, but I think there's some commonalities in terms of what we see in pharmaceutical communication, particularly from a marketing perspective, that have, put us at a point that maybe isn't as high on that totem pole as we could be. And this is really simplifying, but to me, part of it is focusing on, a lot of times we focus on the rules and what we can't say, and focusing on what we're not allowed to say about maybe a data point or a comparative, efficacy study and things of that nature. In certain markets, obviously the rules differ, but in all markets we're heavily regulated, and there is a lot of time spent on sweating what is not able to be communicated versus elements that really can't be regulated, such as clarity, consistency, saying it in the same simple, clear way every time, whatever it is we're saying, and craft, expressing it in the best possible way it can be expressed, both in terms of the language, the visuals, the way it's designed. Those are not elements that are regulated, and I can tell you if they're either as impactful, if not in most cases far more impactful on brand affinity and a sense of comfort and feeling of safety with a brand than any kind of data point could ever be. And really what it comes down to, we see a lot of research about this, that brand effectiveness has a lot to do with safety. And I don't mean safety in the typical sense. We talk about adverse events, medical safety. I mean safety in terms of, when we walk into an airport in a foreign country, there's usually the longest line is at the Starbucks, not at the, maybe the local coffee shop, because we just kind of know the language. We know where to go. We know what it looks like. And maybe I'm saying that from a North American perspective, but there's obviously a safety and comfort in that brand familiarity. Data deluge versus emotive storytelling is really, we are heavily focused on, being as sophisticated and as rationally inclined as possible, thinking in many cases erroneously that that's what's needed in the medical world, that, doctors are not making decisions emotionally and that we need to connect with them at a very rational level. And there's a truth to that. It has to happen at some point, but there's absolutely no truth to the fact that they're not emotive and emotional human beings. And storytelling and connecting at that emotional level is as important with a specialist in the healthcare world as it is with any other human being. And then obviously taking it to the next level to reinforce those beliefs through data and effective communication around the science, it becomes important, but not generally as the initial hook. And then a lot of times, I talked about Nike embracing that human imperfection and where they've arrived in terms of really understanding the underlying journey and the underlying, behavioral drivers and behavioral barriers. Really, they weren't always that way. They, like I showed you, they were talking about the, product features and the benefits of their shoes on the knees and things like that. And that we get caught up on that on the left side of that spectrum quite a bit, saying what we want to say about a product, and instead of really understanding not only the functional benefits and what it means to a patient and to a physician, but the emotional benefits and what that means. And I don't just mean a happy couple walking on the beach, but there's very specific emotional barriers that we can help people overcome in our world, and it's really getting to that and going deep to uncover that. So a lot of times that's because we want to focus, and sometimes it's a speed thing. We obviously, and this is not unique to pharma, but we're on timelines and we want to jump to the quickest possible solution, and we know we want to get something maybe in the hands of a sales rep in front of a doctor, and we maybe don't take the time up front to really uncover what are we truly solving for, what's that really deep underlying insight, and so maybe we jump a little too quickly, and that's something I'll talk a little bit about how to overcome. So there's obviously a number of different ways to map out what the creative process looks like and how we get to these great ideas. And there are, like I said, we can have separate sessions and conversations about all of these elements and interesting ways. I think there are some people that are obviously more inclined to really tap into their creative skills on a regular basis and more practiced in doing it. I think we all have those abilities, and there's certainly tools and techniques to help bring that out of everybody, both individually and as a team. And we can get into all that. Today, though, I want to focus on more so how to guide the process. Whether we're working with, within or with agencies or with people who are, maybe writing for us or designing for us, a lot of us spend time, briefing, supporting, and guiding others in the creative process and collaborating with others in the creative process. So that's where a lot of the focus will be today. We can certainly go deeper in terms of how to drive, get that out of yourself and your team, and really breaking it into three parts, starting with how to kind of brief and give direction, second, how to give feedback, and then third and finally, how to kind of evaluate, good from bad, if you will. So let's jump in to, giving direction. And I think a huge challenge in our world, in the world of communications in general, but no different in the pharma space, is the brief and the time spent on the brief and the output and the quality of the brief, which to me is an absolutely imperative part of driving to more effective communications. So I was going to ask the question to all of you and ask you to participate, but I hit the button too quickly. So now I've given away my answers. But but I do welcome anyone to jump in if you have any thoughts on why we think briefs are important. I mean, one, these are all pretty obvious. One, a lot of times we as a team don't agree on what we should be doing, why a project exists, what it is that we're trying to achieve. So going through the brief and really putting the time into developing a proper brief, and the word brief is right there, so making it brief, requires alignment. It requires us to have those conversations and really boil down what is it that we're actually trying to achieve and being aligned on that direction. So the brief, taking time at the briefing stage forces us to do that, because if we get downstream and we're developing, a campaign and we arrive towards, we're evaluating it at the end and it's been produced and we spent, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and all of a sudden we realize, oh, we're not even on the same page in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. It's a pretty costly mishap. So that briefing stage really forces that. Clarity, as I've talked about, really being, boiling it down to its simplest terms. What are we trying to achieve? Constraint. We talked about constraint in the form of regulation as potentially a negative. There's scientific proof, and we'll talk about it, that constraint is a huge catalyst for creativity. Being unconstrained oftentimes keeps us in that autopilot mode that I talked about. Being constrained forces us to kind of snap out of that, and there's kind of a reduced, functional fixedness, if you will, where we need to actually kind of move into analytical mode and figure things out, figure out solutions. And, the expression necessity is a mother of invention really is a true, scientifically true statement. And then finally, a little inspiration. Anytime we're guiding someone and how to work on create a piece of work, providing some inspiration, some, beyond just the guidance, but a little bit of, a sense of how it could be done or how it's been done before, how different, different types of organizations have maybe solved similar types of problems, even outside of the industry that we're in. All of that can be really helpful in spurring ideas and spurring thoughts. So to me, those are the key. Anyone want to jump in with any other elements they think are key, why a brief is important? And I won't wait too long if nobody wants to be put on the spot.
There's a few comments in the chat, John. I don't know if you can.
Oh, okay. I can't read well. I'm in presentation mode. So I don't know if you want to.
Let me just see if there's one or two here. So, chance to consolidate ideas and reconnect with purpose. And Paul is also saying that sort of passing down sort of the natural history of the sort of projects with the DNA being lost as you move from one brand manager to the next.
It's a great point. Yeah, that's a big one, especially. And I'll talk about the, obviously the reality that you're in. If you're working with the same team and it's a year and a half into a campaign and you're just working on the next project, the brief may look a lot different and a little more concise than if it's, the first time with a new team, really filling them in on where you're coming from. So absolutely, that background can be key in terms of continuity as people change roles. Yeah.
And John, whose job is the brief? Because very often we know clients are lazy. So
great question. Great question. That's actually a perfect segue. So I think the brief's everyone's job. I would say there's an element of the brief, and you could even say there's two separate briefs if we're working in the client agency realm, and we're not always in that realm, but if we are, I think there's a client brief, and then there's what I would call the creative brief that's led by the agency, but it's certainly a collaboration. I talked about that. So Paul, I think you read ahead there. And in fact, I'll talk about this gap. This was a survey done in fact, in the UK, across a number of marketers and agencies. There's obviously a huge divide in terms of the perceived quality of briefs. And this is not strictly pharma, but I think it holds true in this world. And I think a key part I talked about is rushing to get things down on paper. A lot of times the brief is seen as just a box to check, and it's oftentimes a very surface level description of what needs to happen. So I think where we are now, we talk about briefs. They usually have a good broad context of why a project is happening. There's usually a pretty good summation of what the goals are, what the challenges we're facing are, even if those challenges are more around symptoms and surface level. And there's usually a good amount of data and information. I think where we need to go deeper and where the magic is found, really distilling down. And when I talk about focus, there's a real return on focus. Talk about ROI, but ROF to me is more important. If you can wedge your way into a conversation through one poignant, compelling, and resonant angle or point of view, you will then earn the right to talk about the rest of the story. I know we all have a lot to say about our products, our brands, our situation, but finding that one way in, that focused way in, the return will be the opportunity to have the rest of the conversation. If you try to I've used this analogy a bunch, but if you throw 5 or 6 balls at someone at the same time, they're just going to fumble all of them. If you throw one ball, pretty easy to catch, maybe 2 max, but that's pretty hard. Any more than that, there's no chance. So it's one ball at a time is kind of the analogy I like to use. Getting to the core problem, a lot of times we're good at bringing up problems, but they're really symptoms. So are we really peeling back the layers and figuring out what's really underlying that? And then mining for insight and really interesting creative work comes from understanding not just kind of what people are thinking, but what's driving it. What's really getting in the way? What's the tension maybe between the micro level, individual level thinking and maybe the macro cultural trend? And where's that? Those little tension points are where real interesting perspectives are found. So you talked about the different roles, Paul. And I think this, and I'll send, I don't know if anyone is, you're going to get I don't know if I guess you'll get a recording, but either way, I'll send the slides. So no big deal. And there's a bunch of templates I can provide as well. But to me, this is kind of like, I say initial inputs. This is kind of like the client brief, if you will. And the key here is these two perspectives that we often mix the two and conflate the two and maybe have a hard time separating them when we say, well, the goal is increasing market share or it's increasing the size of the market, whatever the case may be. Well, that is neither here nor there when it comes to our customer or our patient. They don't care about our market share or the size of the market. They're worried about solving the problem, whatever that may be. So it's really separating the business perspective, which is important and okay to note, from the audience perspective, which is where that creativity is really going to come from. So having those two as separate points to me is a crucial part. And both not only what our problem is and what the challenge we're facing, but what the goal is. So if the challenge is that I don't know, let's say physicians are too slow to treat exacerbations in COPD, that's a real practical challenge. Our business challenge may be that we have a second line COPD product that's not being used enough and our market share is low. That's our own problem. But to solve it, we really need to get to why is that a problem for the audience? So that those two perspectives become an important part of, I think, the client input, if we're looking at it from a client agency perspective. Getting down to priority focus. This is obviously often done in collaboration with the agency, but the client's got to own what is that number? If we can do one thing, what is that one thing? And it's getting down, forcing us to be exclusive. And that's the hardest part, is getting down to that single-minded proposition. And then obviously parameters. I talked about the importance of constraint, putting those in place. Perfect world, we know kind of what the budget is, timeline. Obviously, if there's an existing infrastructure, if we have a sales force, obviously we're going to want to leverage that. If we're already booked into several conferences and we need to, we want to take advantage of that space, those are important to note in advance so we can develop creativity. I mean, obviously, in a perfect world, you let the creativity dictate kind of the where and the when you show up. But in some cases, we have an existing infrastructure and we can take advantage of that. So giving those guardrails is a crucial part of client input. I'm not going to, again, I can provide this detail. This is a commonly used, at least in my world, creative brief, but I want to focus on the most important part. The top part is kind of that context that was referred to in the earlier comment, kind of the background and why we're here. The bottom part is some of those constraints and some of the more detailed points. The middle is, again, where that magic happens that I talked about, really digging down beneath the surface. And it's about insight, which we're going to talk about in a sec, getting to the real problem, and then being single-minded and focused. So how do we get to the real problem? It's about asking why. And you've got to often peel back, 7, 8, even 9 layers of that onion to really get to a core underlying problem. And again, making sure it's a problem for the audience and not just for us. So it may start as, sales are slowing down. That's certainly not a problem for the audience. That's a problem for us as a business. But when you peel back the layers of the onion, we can get to, well, A, what's causing that from a business perspective? Because part of the solve might be how we, operationalize and inspire our team. But when it comes to the audience problem, we're going to start to peel back what's really driving their lack of belief in our product or their lack of perceived need for our product. And you can start to peel back not just the fact that they do have a lack of belief, but why and what's driving it. So again, asking why, peeling back the layers becomes super important. And there's a number of exercises that we use workshop-wise to get to that I'd be happy to talk about. I want to talk about insight though. And, people often conflate an insight from a thought or an idea. And to me, the difference is this idea of being revelatory, something that it could be the same problem we've looked at over and over again for many years, but coming at it from an entirely new perspective. a line that a colleague of mine used to use is, it's got to be surprising but inevitable, meaning it catches you off guard. And a lot of comedy is this way. It catches you off guard, but then you immediately say, yeah, okay, absolutely, that makes sense. And that to me is where the magic happens from a creativity standpoint, is when the insight is something that's revelatory and different. And then again, we talk, what reaction should it garner? The normal reaction to, I give you a thought or a fact about somebody, you'll kind of be like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. This GIF or GIF, I guess I'm too old to know how to pronounce that. That's kind of what you're looking for. That aha, visceral reaction. Okay, that makes sense. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that is really smart. Not I hadn't thought of it that way, and I have no idea what you're talking about. It's I hadn't thought of it that way, but that now makes sense. So that's surprising but inevitable to me is the best way to sum that up. And there's some really interesting tricks using AI. I think it's very hard to force yourself to take a different perspective. So there's a collaborative element to this. But one of the tricks we use with even just as simple as ChatGPT is asking it contrarian questions. So for example, I could say, what are the 10 biggest advantages of product X? I'm using a really simple example. And then pick one or two of those advantages and say, okay, what are the 5 biggest challenges with this particular advantage? And then, you see it comes up with a list of challenges, and then pick one of the challenges and say, well, what are the biggest opportunities associated with this particular challenge? And go back and forth, because we have a hard time kind of changing perspectives on the fly, but in terms of where we have biases and emotions. One of the advantages of our AI partners is they don't have that emotional connection to their own thinking, and to get it to immediately change perspective, while it's not going to be high quality at all times, it's going to give you a quantity and a volume of completely different ideas that you can then suss out. And that's why I always say ask for a list of 5 or 10, because generally speaking, 80% of them are going to be thrown out right away. But again, getting it to go back and forth will often give you a contrarian look. The best example I can think of is I want to say it was Hilton, and this is pre-AI, but their insight was, most hotels talked about trying to help you feel like you're at home.
This today, thank you.
Oh, sorry. Hilton's campaign was "We're not like home," and their insight was, well, everyone's saying they want to make you feel like you're at home, but the reality is nobody feels like home at a hotel, and maybe that's a good thing. It's a getaway. It's an escape. You don't want to feel like home. So they really jumped on that. And that, again, I don't think this was in the days long before generative AI, but they were able to kind of come to that contrarian way of looking at a problem in a positive way to say, okay, that's a new way at it. Let's talk about all the reasons why not being like home is a good thing. And that was a big part of Hilton's promotion or marketing for many years. I want to now talk about constraint. And I've talked about it a little bit, but the science behind why constraint is really a catalyst for creativity and not an impediment as we often think of it, and a few practical ways to kind of bring that out. So how do we elevate creativity in the face of constraint? Well, the first one that's not even on this list is knowing the rules. At no point are we suggesting to break them or to not be compliant. But a lot of those, there are many shades of gray when it comes to the regulatory nature of our world and many ways to interpret communication. So really understanding not only the rules themselves and kind of those chalk lines, like almost like a tennis court. The line is not 1 millimeter; it's maybe 6 inches long, thick. So there's some wiggle room in there. But also understanding who the umpire is in the tennis comparison, and having a relationship with the regulators and understanding what they're looking for and how to work with them to get to a place, so they know what we're trying to achieve, and less hung up on the exact words and what we're specifically showing or saying. So that part is super important. But really, in order to get to something that connects, regardless of what you can and can't say, really understanding the journey, and a lot of what I talked about, going deeper to know those barriers and those drivers, and really what's underlying. I'll go back to the Nike example, that the struggle of running and the fact that nobody really enjoys it or looks forward to the run. They just feel great about it after. And it's this common love-hate relationship with their passion. That Nike tapping into that is really the essence of what makes them a great brand. And I think those stories exist in every category that we're in. Showing up in unexpected ways. So showing up in the expected places, but in unexpected ways, and also showing up in unexpected places is great. A campaign that was making news in Canada yesterday was for IKEA, obviously the furniture store. And they were sending people Instagram direct messages at about 1 or 2 in the morning saying, "You still up?" which obviously has a bit of a sexual innuendo to it, the middle of the night direct message. And then if someone replied, they sent them saying, oh, if you're having trouble sleeping, here's 15 or 20% off a new mattress. Come check it out. So a really clever way to tap into, a problem they're solving, a really unexpected way. They're showing up both in an unexpected place, in an unexpected way, to solve a problem that's they're selling mattresses, helping people sleep. So if people are up in the middle of the night, there's a chance they're struggling to sleep. So a really interesting and thought-provoking and attention-grabbing way to show up differently without or just saying we have discount on a new mattress. There's nothing fancy about the message. It's just the way they showed up. Integrated experience, making sure every element of the experience is cohesive and works together. And it's not just like we're throwing a bunch of things at the wall, but that it's all part of understanding how people go through from learning about a product or hearing about it for the first time, to then learning about it, to becoming interested, to becoming more familiar with how to use it, et cetera, and then getting into eventually using it. So it's creating that fully integrated experience across touch points, and then making use of negative space. Sometimes what we can't say can be very powerful. And there's a million examples, but visually, you can look at elements like this, or you can look at them like this, where here there's 3 separate elements and the negative space says nothing. And the way they're arranged, and this is just a visual example, all of a sudden the negative space tells a story. And one example, this is going back probably 15 years, maybe 20 years, this is a Canadian Viagra ad. And really all they're saying is good morning, and it tells an entire story. And this is at a point when people already knew what Viagra was, and obviously in Canada, they were especially a consumer facing ad, there's not allowed to be any reference to what the product does or what it's for or the indication. And they did this masterfully without saying a word about what the product is for or what it does functionally. And again, it's using the negative space, and it's what you're not saying and not showing that tells the entire story. So clever ways to use that, use what you can't say to your advantage. And then, we talk about how to overcome constraint. I think I talked earlier about branding fundamentals. Remembering what's not constrained is so important. We spend so much of our time focusing on what we can and can't, say about our efficacy and safety, et cetera. And we don't spend enough time focusing on those, I say the 3 C's of branding: clarity, consistency, and craft. And that, to me, none of that is regulated. None of that is restricted. And if we focus much more of our energy on that and creating that consistent, comfortable experience for our customers, what we say would matter much less. Though it still matters, it would matter much less. And then finally, being of service. There's many categories where we, regardless of what we say, helping simplify life for our customers and helping them get better at their job goes a long way toward building a trusting partnership and building affinity for what we have to offer from a product standpoint. Whether that's helping their practice, whether that's, if our product is in a certain category, obviously patient support, supporting the associations, helping diagnosis, especially in rare disease, helping with patient identification, all of these ways to be of service that are kind of adjacent, but not directly connected to sales of our product, go a long way toward building that partnership. And again, those aren't elements that are regulated or restricted. Those are things that we can do outside of the constrained world that we live in, or outside of the constraints, I should say. And I talked a little bit about AI. The example I used, I talked about belief breaking, that kind of back and forth. AI is everywhere, and we could have a whole session on how to leverage AI for creativity. But a few simple ways that we could all do starting today. It obviously helps with first drafts. It doesn't replace good, emotive communication and writing, but it can help get things down on paper, give you a place to start, which is often the hardest part for a lot of people. I know myself, when it comes to writing, is just getting something down. And if you can even verbalize and record yourself speaking, even in the car, a few thoughts and have it come to you with a first draft, wow, even if it's only a C- at that point, what a huge time saver and a huge advantage that can be. I talk about insight mining and different ways to use the emotionless kind of completely objective nature of AI to your advantage, because it's very hard for any of us as humans to break out of our own kind of ways of thinking and points of view to take on a new point of view. So it can be a great partner in that way, as can other people, obviously. Brevity. So if you have something already down and you're like, it just feels too long, like maybe what my presentation right now, you can run it through and say, get this down to 10 slides. And again, it'll take some massaging and refinement, but it's a starting point. It's a partner that can help you do that. And then critical appraisal. I think it's getting better and better at really thinking in a more critical way. And so, while I wouldn't recommend using an AI tool as the only critical reviewer or appraiser of work, it certainly is a great tool in that respect. So any questions? I know I've been going, just a few more slides. I want to talk about how to give effective feedback, but any questions or thoughts so far? You can jump in. I can't see if there's comments, but.
The only one that strikes me, John, is I buy all of this. And this was the approach I took as a client. And even now we've got a project with one client and we're doing this. So this is completely correct. The issue is many clients just want a creative concept. And they almost want you to guess at that first stage. So how do you convince the client to suspend judgment? Because you're getting to know their brand and coming up with a conceptual underlying foundation that will make their brand successful, and they want a shiny picture that ultimately is their next ad campaign. And that was all, and that's how agencies lived and died, in my experience. They didn't come up with a shiny campaign, whereas the best agencies didn't get it right, but they got close. So how do you deal with that? An agent's,
I think there's
impatient client.
Yeah, it's hard. I think there's an element of, I think it's twofold. One, it's finding some quick wins, because not everything has to, I think there's some ways to go from, where they are to slightly elevated within the current realm. So it's not all, okay, wait for the big reveal, especially nowadays in this kind of iterative world. It used to be all measure twice, cut once. And now you can really, kind of go with that MVP approach and have more of a bias for action. So I think that helps in some respects to get things off the ground. So not everything is a big waiting game. And then number two, I think it's walking through the process, helping them understand the intention of each step and showing examples of how it's worked before from beginning to end, whether it's Nike or something more, close to home, and helping them understand every element of the process and the purpose it serves. And I'm going to talk on the next couple slides about feedback and the types of feedback that work best at each stage. I think if you give a sense of where we're going to get to and why each step is the way it is, and why to kind of pull back the reins a little looser at certain steps while tightening them at other steps, why it helps. I think, like anyone, if you understand why you're being asked to do things a certain way, it's easier to fall in line. That doesn't mean it's perfect, and it doesn't mean it's always the case. And then obviously, I think measurability is obviously a big factor, but applying the right measurements to the right effort. So if, we talk about the balance between performance marketing, trying to drive to a specific action, versus brand building, and obviously both have an important role to play. And I think the stronger the brand in the long term, that to me, there definitely should be a bias in that direction, but harder to measure. So I think making sure there's methodologies and thinking in place to understand, things like more superfluous measurements like brand affinity, brand equity or brand loyalty, finding ways to, develop a baseline understanding of that and how it's either improving or not improving over time can go a long way in that regard. Because you may run a campaign that doesn't immediately, quote unquote, perform from a quantitative perspective, but it's still moving the brand in the right direction from a belief and equity perspective. So having ways to measure that, or being comfortable with ambiguity and making sure everyone's on the same page, trusting the process and having a little bit of blind faith in what we don't know can also work, as long as there's acknowledgement. But having that measurement conversation up front, so we're not saying, well, we're trying to develop this big kind of bold new brand, but it's not driving enough clicks in the first month. If those dots aren't necessarily going to connect, nor do they need to. So it's just making sure that the right expectations are set. But I think feedback becomes a big part of it. So again, another great segue, Paul. So we talked about this process. I want to talk about just the two different types of feedback very quickly. So early on, we call it the incubation stage, as the ideas are kind of newly baked. It's very important and we borrow these principles from improv, to not shut things down too quickly and not get too caught up in the feasibility and the details and the specifics, and really take that yes and approach. It's about accepting and really being open to receiving ideas. Nike doesn't stumble into that call it accidental ad, where they talk about that runner's journey, if they didn't allow for a completely new idea to kind of take shape and to run with it and to run that, to literally run it in a magazine that one time. We were talking, Nigel and I were talking earlier about the Beatles. A lot of their lyrics they kind of stumbled into by accident. Now they're on T-shirts and they're way of life for people. Not all of that was intentionally done from the beginning that way, and but they certainly were incredible at recognizing it when it was happening and kind of capturing lightning in a bottle. So really being open to ideas and building on the premise of every idea. Trying to take the audience's point of view to get out of your own prism, and then focus on that overall emotive connection, emotional reaction, not the details. That there is a time that will come in the next slide even for the details. And then recognize that we don't need to pressure test every idea at the very beginning. They'll probably crack under pressure at the first stage. And that's okay. That's not the time to do that. So this incubation stage is really about building on ideas. It's that yes and adding to the ideas, that approach. As we get down to the next, second, third draft, then it becomes more about refinement. And that's when it's not a no, it's a no, but, or not only that, but, and it's still additive, but that's when we can start to pare things down, get to what matters most, consider some of the practicalities that, not that we completely ignored at the beginning, but that we didn't want to, bring to the surface as much around budget, around feasibility, around obviously viability from a regulatory standpoint, what we can and can't say, getting into the details, and then starting to stress test, how is this going to work? Why is this the right approach versus that approach? So all of those things come at the refinement stage. So I think the most important part is all of these things matter when it comes to feedback. It's just, you don't want to do it too early. And that to me, so your question, Paul, in terms of how do we help clients along, I think it's really making sure they're aligned to this process, because some of the best ideas get kiboshed before they ever see the light of day, because of this, because they jump to this type of feedback too early in the process. So it's understanding how you will get to this, but not right away. Now, I think if you work with 15 or 20 different agencies, you'll see 15 or 20 different creative evaluation scorecards, criteria. They're all some element of, usually they're about 80% overlap with some interesting angles. I tried to really simplify it down. And this is not just about a big creative concept. This could be any communication. So to me, and there's more elements you could add as sub bullets here, but really what it comes down to is great communication should have some element of surprise. It shouldn't be exactly what's expected. It shouldn't blend in with the scenery. It's going to be hard to capture. We talk about attention being a key ingredient. It's going to be hard to capture attention if there's not some level of surprise or unexpectedness to it. But again, also inevitable. It still makes sense. It still fits. And it's still, you nod your head, you're not completely caught off guard. Simple. It can be explained in a single sentence. It doesn't take a long time to kind of break down. So yes, clever is good, and maybe doing something that's a little bit out there is good. But if it can't be easily explained, it might be a bridge too far. Ownable. And this goes to the branding elements we talked about. But if you could just swap any competitor's logo or any other brand's logo in there, you're not going to last long. That communication is not going to be effective for long. It's going to be a sea of sameness, as many categories are. So really finding an idea where only your brand, it only works for your brand. That's really, I talked about return on focus. That means you're focusing on the right element, that where you're truly differentiated. Otherwise, you're basically just jumping on board with everybody else. And then well-crafted, really focusing on the polish and the detail, and the expression, again, those things that can't be regulated, the refinement and making it look like yours and feel like yours. Oftentimes we're too quick to just put something out there and not worry too much about how it looks, and how it feels and how it comes across. And that the craft is something that matters so much and is often not given the time of day or the attention that it needs. So to me, if you had to boil it down to 4, you can pick 10 other criteria if you want. These, I would say, checking all these boxes is a great start. So before I wrap up or take questions and have some discussion, there's some key kind of underlying themes that we talked about a bunch of times today that if you have to leave, and I'm probably not doing a great job practicing what I preach, because there probably should be 2 or 3 of these, and I only got it down to 5. So forgive me for that. Easy to, practice, do as I say, not as I do. But imperfection, embracing the human imperfection. And if you look at a common thread between every successful brand, there's an element of this, whether it's Apple, Nike, Disney, you name it. there's an element of understanding what people go through, that people aren't perfect beings, and embracing that and understanding that and really identifying and empathizing with that, it helps to communicate effectively to those people. Finding new ways and revelatory ways to look at the problem, remembering this idea of return on focus, that if you get in with that one thing, it'll give you the opportunity to tell the rest of the story down the road. Constraint, use it and leverage it, and think of it as a catalyst. Even just thinking of it that way flips the attitude. I think a lot of people in our industry spend a lot of time lamenting what we can't do and our hands are tied and all that kind of stuff. And I think just having this attitude around the benefits of constraint really starts to flip the culture and flip the mindset of a team in a positive way, and leads to great ideas and great collaboration, in my opinion. And then I've said it a million times with branding, those key fundamentals, especially those 3 C's. Those aren't elements that get regulated, and they're elements that too often aren't done well. And it's an easy thing to make sure that we get right, just creating that consistent, clear, and well-crafted experience. So those are my, I talked about focus. Those are my 5 key takeaways for today. And with that, I appreciate your time. Any comments, questions? Would love to
We've got
chat.
our first hand up from Gordon.
John, thank you for a great presentation. Many of the people on the call, including ourselves, routinely take and get briefs from clients, and you've talked about alignment, clarity, consistency, and so on. What are your sort of 2 or 3 watch outs or things that we should all be doing when we're trying to take a brief from a client who often, as you rightly say, don't quite know what they're doing for many reasons?
It's a good question. I think there's a few, there's many. The 2 keys: one, do they know truly what we're trying to accomplish? Or are they clear on it, and are they aligned? And is there one thing? So that, like, looking first at maybe the objective statement. Often it's not even written as an objective. It's, you'll read the heading objective and it'll say, create a new sales aid for the reps. Or like, that's okay. That's a project description, but that's not the objective. So what I would first look at, A, are they expressing what it is that we want to achieve? And B, can they express it as one clear statement, that if we do one thing with this, whatever this work is, it's got to be this. And yes, there might be some sub bullets and some secondary objectives, but making sure that there's one objective and that it is actually written as an objective would be the first thing. And number 2, and this is the part that's more of a collaboration, so I wouldn't necessarily expect it up front, but that deep understanding of the audience journey to be able to get to an effective insight. Obviously any research, any background they have on that journey and what they know about customers, not only their thoughts about the product, but about the category and the condition, that input to me is crucial. And if they don't have a lot of it, then that means there's going to be, managing expectations around how important it is to get to and to go through a discovery process becomes key. But if they have that input and they have any kind of research that's been done or feedback they've gotten, even just talking to customers about product experiences, that to me, even if it's not directly in a briefing document, becomes a huge input.
Thank you.
I would also say, John, your explaining the process is critical, because I think that stops them jumping to conclusions. You've given a very clear expression of the whole creative process about finding insight. And if a client is patient, they will get such a better result as a result going through that than us guessing the answer at hello.
Totally agree. I agree. I think that's crucial, not rushing to the answer and to the solution, because letting it stew a little bit often leads to better solutions, but also bringing the agencies or partners in at the problem stage. So not, oftentimes we've seen the client teams will sit in a room, say, here's a problem, here's how we're going to solve it. Now let's go to the agency or partner to create it. And yes, they'll get it. Maybe they'll get a B- tool. But if you go to the agency and collaborate from the problem stage and say, here's what we're trying to solve, let's make sure that we've unpacked the problem effectively and really gotten to what the root of the problem really is, and then collaborate on what the solution should be. I find oftentimes that's how you get to kind of the A+ solution, as opposed to just, okay, we'll do what you ask for and we'll deliver it, but it's not going to be anything special.
Good. So any other questions? Maybe I'll ask a question, John, if there's nothing immediate.
Sure.
Just thinking back to my last employer, actually, he's head of medical affairs, and I was actually tasked in small biotech in actually working with an agency to create the global brand name for our first launch. And actually, we employed Alex Applebaum, who's a member of Phraktion. Actually, he did a fantastic job for us. Put forward several new candidates for great new names. But really, the CEO throughout was married to the name he wanted, and we went through a process. And there was different voices heard, but at the end of the day, we ended up with the name that the CEO wanted from the very outset. So really, we didn't need to do any of the exercise or any creativity. But just wonder if you have any advice around that. How do you manage your clients, maybe senior voices through the process? How do you sort of get around those obstacles, maybe?
It's a great question. I mean, the politics are just reality, and when I say embracing human imperfection, that's not just the customer or the audience. That's also the team. It's the people we're working with. It's the clients. It's everybody. So it's understanding that the kind of psychology as best as we can and working with it. Now, there's an element there's of control and ownership where at some point, if that's what the person who owns it wants, we've got to try and it's, obviously if it's within ethical boundaries and legal boundaries, make the best of it and bring in the elements. Even, I wouldn't say, you talked about the exercise being wasted. Some of the thoughts and potential outputs that came out of that exercise maybe can still be brought to bear with that, maybe less desirable name. So that's a kind of worst case scenario, is kind of making the best of it. But I think, again, Paul brought it up, walking through the process, so walking through why the naming process in that case is what it is and how it works and what names evoke, and what even things like fonts and colors and the way a name is expressed is what that evokes and the impact that has, and examples of how it's worked before and maybe how it hasn't worked with certain brands. I think that's the best you can do to try and convince that person. Ultimately, that if that person's a decision maker and it's, and their decision is such that, they're not going to go the way you want, like I said, making the best of it, as long as it doesn't cross certain bounds, is to me the best case scenario. But when we say embracing human imperfection, like anything, when you're trying to convince someone who's hard-headed or stubborn to change their thought or change their behavior, you got to disrupt the way they're thinking and give them evidence that it's wrong, and then ease them into kind of a new way of approaching it. So it's no different than what we try to do with our customers and marketing. Our client becomes the audience in that case, and it's disrupting their current thinking, and then it's giving evidence of why it's wrong, and doing it in a way that's empathetic and understanding of their perspective and maybe their fear or their hesitation to go in a different direction, and then slowly bringing it to a point that you want to get it to, but with evidence and support to back it up. So it's going through that same process. And maybe I'm being a little idealistic right now, because in some cases you don't have the time, and the CEO or owner is going to make their decision. But I think there is an element of, if you apply that same behavioral science construct around disrupt current thinking, provide evidence, support, etc., you can maybe get them to kind of change their mind and ingrain a new habit or a new way of thinking.
Yeah. Thanks, John. So just in case the CEO is watching this recording, great CEO, and actually the name wasn't so bad after all. But there you go. But, so I don't know if there's any other questions. I don't see anything necessarily on the chat straight away. Paul?
Not in the chat.
I have a question.
Sanjay.
I don't know if there's enough time to talk, but John, very nice presentation. Quickly, and you did talk about AI implementation and how it's coming to space now. I don't know, maybe this question may be for another time, but in terms of insights generation and using AI, I mean, in just recently, this has been now adopted. How do you see the AIs adding value or getting insights that probably humans are not able to do it? And is there any data on that now, or it's evolved over time?
I don't, if there is data, I'm naive to it, but I'm sure there is. But I think the immediate access to, all of the relevant examples that have happened before is in a way that none of us can really tap into as individuals is helpful. I think to me, AI, whether it's insight generation or anything else, it's just knowing its limitations and using it, leveraging it as a partner and not as the be all end all answer is the key. So I use it all the time to pressure test ideas, even to do what I talked about, the kind of belief breaking approach and trying to go back and forth. Now, I don't know that I have data to suggest for any brand that it's elevated the insight in any way, or so. But I think logically speaking, like I said, it can do things in a way that at a speed, from an objectivity and from an emotionlessness standpoint, that humans can never really achieve. And we spend a lot of times in creative workshops and communication workshops trying to get to use exercises. A lot of it borrowed from, I talk about improv and tools used by comedians and comedic writers to get to breaking us out of our usual ways of thinking. Because a lot of comedy is setting an expectation and then breaking it. And good insight is usually about, again, a new perspective, a revelatory way of looking at a pretty common problem. And so getting to that is not easy. I think using AI for its objectivity and for its incredible ability to tap into millions of examples instantly, and then bring that in a crystallized way to, here are 5 things I think, or 5 things that I can provide you with, to me becomes a huge advantage. I don't have any quantitative evidence that it's working better than maybe the pre-generative AI days, but it seems logically like if we're taking advantage of these tools that we should be able to get to more interesting insights more quickly with less help.
May I chip in, Jonathan? My expertise is in AI and generative AI, and in 1 or 2 months will be paper where I provide the statistics, how much AI is changing our life. First of all, fundamentally, your thought that AI is our assistant is absolutely correct, and in this way it will remain. And actually, full benefit of AI can be seen when it is overseen by experienced, knowledgeable, and open-minded people. So actually people with more experience are even more valuable as long as they are open-minded. I'm actively using generative AI because there are different levels of reliability today already on the market, and another upcoming paper aims to clarify that. And it speeds me up enormously, and the accuracy is absolutely incomparable. Just one hint: when I create patient personas, it goes through numerous files, which as a human you would not be able to do it, and takes much more elements into consideration. So the personas generated through that means, of course, if you have correctly set up and so on, is much more accurate than any agency can produce. And on top of it is just in few seconds compared to time that any traditional agency would need. Plus, I can call those personas, they can talk with me, and they can talk among themselves. So it's about our proficiency, our expertise, and of course the application that you use. So I don't want to take spot from you. I just wanted to clarify you are spot on, and there is a future in AI. So keep up. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great insight.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Looking forward to reading that.
So John, I think we're actually past the top of the hour now, so really I should let everyone get on now. So, but again, thank you, John. Great session. Again, I think an exemplar of really the high expertise we have available at Phraktion. Just going back to the very comments at the very start of this, Phraktion does offer, the very best in the industry on a fractional expertise basis. So if you've not heard of us before, please come and check us out at Phraktion and maybe have a conversation with John or anybody else on the screen or beyond at Phraktion, of course. So with that, thank you. But just to remind you, we have another session just 1 week away. You'll see details of that coming out very soon when we look at teamwork, actually. Head and Bly will be helping us look at teams. And then in 2 weeks after that, we'll actually be looking at AI and how we can actually use AI as consultants to our advantage. So maybe just some comments as we...
Perfect segue.
But thanks, John. Thank you, everybody. We'll close there. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thanks so much, everyone. Talk soon. Thank you.
Thanks,